Welcome to everyone who's joining. We'll get started in about just a few seconds time. And I think, given that we're about a minute after our go live time, we will make a start now. Welcome everyone to tonight's NUJ Talking event, which is entitled Right to Know. My name's Sian Jones and I'm the NUJ President, and I'll be chairing this evening's events. We've got a fantastic lineup of journalists for you today, all NUJ members, and they will be explaining the problems that they've found in their own line of work. This evening we're going to be talking about how, increasingly we're finding that the government is clamping down on information that should be in the public domain, whether that's through legislation or other bureaucratic moves, and it's becoming more difficult to find out information which frankly is in the public interest. So the reason why the wonderful panel that we have tonight for you have been pulled together is that their work all relates to the first principle in the NUJ's ethics code, which I will just read out for you now, which is at all times upholds and defends the principle of media freedom, the right of freedom of expression, and the right of the public to be informed. Just a little bit of housekeeping for you. We're recording tonight's event and it will be published on the NUJ's website afterwards. You'll see that there's a chat box over on the right hand side. Please do introduce yourselves, say hello. But if you would like to ask a question of the panel, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our first speaker of this evening, which is Jenna Corderoy, who is a reporter at openDemocracy's investigations team, who the NUJ has been working with on freedom of information, among other things. Jenna, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me to speak today. I feel that the right to know, specifically accessing information under the Freedom of Information Act, I mean, it has always been under attack, or at least there's a constant threat, but it feels like it's even more so today. And coupled with, for example, government departments publishing incomplete ministerial meetings data and the lack of detail over COVID so-called VIP lanes, I really do think there's a transparency crisis in the heart of Westminster. We know that government departments are less likely to grant a freedom of information request in full. When you appeal against a refusal, you submit an internal review, but those aren't answered within the timeframes. You could be waiting for months. Then you complain to the Information Commissioner's Office. That can take 6 months to get an outcome. We know that the ICO's budget has been cut and the FOI caseload has only increased. And if you go to the tribunal, like I have several times, you're looking at years to get the information that you want. So it's not fantastic at the minute. At openDemocracy, we've been investigating the state of FOI in the UK, and I would really encourage people to read our findings in a report that we published last year called The Art of Darkness by Lucas Amin. It paints a very worrying picture of FOI and the obstacles that journalists face when accessing information. So I'll talk about our recent investigation into the clearinghouse. So during when we was looking into the state of FOI, we came across something called the clearinghouse, which is operated by the Cabinet Office. And what happens is that when government departments and government agencies receive a sensitive or round-robin request, they are alerted to the clearinghouse. And the clearinghouse also circulates a list of requests, mainly originating from journalists, campaigners and researchers across Whitehall, which also contains the advice on how government departments should respond to those requests, as well as, importantly, the names of those requesters. Now, the clearinghouse has existed for some time, with the Cabinet Office taking it over from the Ministry of Justice in 2015. But prior to when we published our investigation into the clearinghouse in November 2020, there was nothing about how the Cabinet Office operated it. It was only just a couple of weeks before we went to the courts. The Cabinet Office published more information about the clearinghouse, including a list of triggers for when requests should be forwarded to them. At openDemocracy, like I say, we went to the tribunal last month in order to get hold of these lists that the clearinghouse circulates and the advice. that they give to departments, and I asked for this in August 2018, and I'm probably going to get a judgment in a couple of weeks, maybe even several months' time. So that whole process has taken approximately 3 years, which is not fantastic when it comes to the right to know. And there's lots of concerns about how the clearinghouse is operating. First of all, the Cabinet Office giving advice to other government departments when the Cabinet Office has got one of the worst records on FOI doesn't really fulfill me with much enthusiasm. There are also applicant blindness principles at play, as well as some data protection issues with the circulation of the requesters' names. And if you are interested in that, I would encourage you to read a piece by John Baines, a data protection expert, which can be found on the openDemocracy website. And I would also urge you to read a recent piece by the Times journalist George Greenwood, who submitted a subject access request to the Cabinet Office. And after many months, he managed to get hold of emails where it was clear that government departments and agencies were flagging his FOI request as sensitive because he's a journalist. It says in black and white the emails that he obtained. Now, also concerning is that I believe that the clearinghouse is contributing to the delays experienced by FOI requesters. We reported on a brilliant campaigner called Jason Evans, who has worked very hard to obtain documents about the infected blood scandal. And he's had so many sort of delays caused by the clearinghouse. In one example, he put in an FOI request to the Treasury, which was then referred to the clearinghouse. And as the two departments were going back and forth for what exemption to apply here, or and that whole process took 5 months before Jason Evans got a response. It's just slowing down the process, which is not acceptable. And documents that we've seen also show that the Cabinet Office clearinghouse was discouraging the Treasury from making a disclosure. So yeah, it's a pretty dismal picture of FOI, but the question is, I pose to myself, is how can we as journalists defend the right to know? And I like to think there are numerous ways in which one could possibly do that. Honestly, firstly, when you get an FOI refusal, I would really encourage you to think about challenging it. When you receive an FOI refusal and your instinct is, well, that can't be right. In many instances, yes, you are correct. And I know it takes time to challenge refusals, but you can't let them, especially central government departments, get away with it. And there are honestly lots of resources out there that can help you craft your appeals. Secondly, if you think your request was not handled properly, in the sense that you've been plagued with delays, I would recommend you putting in a meta FOI request, where you simply ask for the communications surrounding the handling of your original request. And it's a real insight into the processes and what goes behind the scenes when dealing with your request for information. And thirdly, and sort of on the same theme, and like what George Greenwood did, is to put in a subject access request under the Data Protection Act, and trying to get hold of emails that refer or relate to you. It is a interesting exercise. You may be able to get hold of emails where government departments may have been talking about you and your work. And lastly, and anecdotally, and I'll wrap up, it is absolutely fantastic to see more media outlets dedicate space on FOI policy. And, I love reading stories, and I think there's more of them recently of journalists going to the tribunal to get hold of information that is of significant public interest, which is really great. And I love those kind of stories, and I really like a good fight, like an FOI fight, mainly. And to conclude, I think FOI has been responsible for some incredible scoops across the years, but it's also importantly, a tool which allows people to access vital information. It helps us to hold the powerful to account and scrutinize decisions that can have a real impact on people's lives. And I really feel passionate that we can't let the FOI Act become obsolete, and we have to defend it. I'm done. Finished. Over to you, Rob.
Thanks so much, Jenna. Without further ado, I think we'll hand straight over to Rob Evans from The Guardian, please. Rob, you're on mute.
In classic style. Hello, I'm Rob Evans. I've worked at the Guardian for, well, I don't know, 1999 I joined. Thank you very much for inviting me. And also, I just wanted to say that thank you also to Jenna for a great introduction, for great work that Open Democracy has been doing on freedom of information, because this is very important. I mean, the Act came in 2005, and I mean, frankly, it's always under threat. You could see this going right back to Tony Blair's government, who brought it in. After a couple of years, they tried to neuter it. So I think the key to defending it is actually a very broad-based coalition of people, right across the industry, right across all sorts of campaigners. And the key is always just to keep on using it, and yes, I think it is just keep on using it and to show how useful it is. At the Guardian, we fought a very long battle that went up to the Supreme Court about getting hold of the lobbying letters known as the Black Spider memos that Prince Charles had been writing to ministers, and we knew he wrote, but we didn't really know what he wrote about. And we fought a long case that we won at the Supreme Court, which lasted 10 years. And we got hold of those letters. But the thing is, I think in a way, it was an unusual case, that because we were lucky at the Guardian that we could employ, pretty expensive lawyers who could fight that case. But I think the strength of the Act is actually about people, in local papers, local radio, local TV, national papers, all using the Act. And that's the way you get a broad-based sort of support for to preserve the Act. The other thing I just wanted to talk about, which I've been asked to talk about, is about the undercover policing scandal, which is essentially how the police used undercover officers to spy on more than 1,000 political groups over a long-running campaign operation that lasted more than 4 years. 4 decades. And I mean, we were lucky that we had a whistleblower called Peter Francis, who used to be an undercover officer, who actually was in essence, he was sort of appalled by what he had seen while he was undercover. And he came forward and sort of told us in great detail about how this very covert operation had been run. And, in essence, the police don't like whistleblowers because they come out and tell the truth, and they want to, they either try to smear them or they try to prosecute them. And they tried at one point to try and prosecute Peter Francis, but I mean, one thing we did was that we published the fact that they wanted to do this, and it sort of, the police melted away a little bit after that. So all I'd say really is that whistleblowers are very important. Treat them seriously when they come forward, and treat them well. I'm just going to say 2 other things. Is that one thing that really came apparent when we were starting to look at the undercover police scandal was that there'd been so much bad behaviour with the police. They had been deceiving women into relationships. They had been spying on justice campaigns run by the likes of Stephen Lawrence family. They'd been lying in court. There was just so much bad behaviour there, in a sense that when we started looking at it, it was like the dam, breaking open. And there had been lots of people who had also, the women had been looking at and investigating what had been going on. And I think the key for us was always to, work with people who were also seeking to bring out what was going on, and they were enormously helpful. So I always think that, find people who really who are appalled by what's been going on, and they will help you. And I just wanted to end with one last thing, is that, you know, I know sometimes we feel a bit down and gloomy about things, but I always just think, you know, keep on going, make another call, go and see someone else, just keep on going, and then things will hopefully break open for you. And our job is to challenge power. Our job is not to you know, suck up to people, the rich and famous. Our job is to be the awkward squad. And when I look at the panel, I see people who are members of the awkward squad, and that is our job.
Thank you, Rob. Some great tips there for all of us. I'm going to move now on to Paul Lashmar, who's an investigative journalist in his own right and also head of the journalism department at City University. Paul.
Good afternoon. The first thing I want to talk about a little bit is that is that, you know, the essence of all this is about accountability, and that was really important. For much of my career, I've covered things like intelligence and also organised crime, and tracking down and keeping an eye on how those operate is got much more difficult, I think, since Snowden. I mean, the last time we had a major leak in that regard of contemporary material was Snowden, and Snowden was 2013, and we are, you know, it's getting harder and harder because of the technology. So I think, you know, what is important about what Rob's been doing is that over the years, whenever I've done a story revealing some wrongdoing, either with intelligence or within policing, the answer has always been, in the words of the 70s song, "It's all right now." And I think, you know, what Rob has done is to take an example, because the Special Demonstration Squad is a really, you know, good example of how things aren't all right now. They weren't all right for 40 years. And the fact is, you have to keep a very close eye on these people, because the more secret they operate, and which they are operating now in almost total secrecy, because we can't get near them. We can't get, the National Crime Agency operates on the same basis as MI5. It's not a policing operation in that sense. We can't get near them. We're trying. We always try, but actually, when was the last time you saw a really good intelligence leak? It's been a while. And so, you know, it's so important, because when we don't pay attention, you get 40 years of spy cops. And it's a really good example, which I use to this effect. I just did a book recently about looking at over 40 years of intelligence. And I say, you know, the spy cops is just a brilliant example of why journalists need to be on this case. Now, what I've also noticed, and I do feel we're going backwards. I mean, that's one of the things. We you know, I feel that, you know, when I started in the late 70s, I thought that we were making progress through the freedom of information, and we were winning the argument about scrutiny and accountability. And I feel over the last 10 years, we started very, very quickly to go backwards, and it's getting harder. And there are all sorts of tricks. And I mean, you know, the obvious one at the moment will be WhatsApp. I'm sure that a lot of interesting discussions within, which would have once been written in very nicely handwritten fountain pens, are now all done on WhatsApp, and we won't get a sight of them. So there is a whole lot of things that we need to attack. But one of the things that I just want to come back to is I always like to tell a story in these things when we're talking, because it makes it a bit more real. So besides tending to the day job, I have kept my hand in with a bit of investigative journalism. So I'm going to try and just quickly sum up a whole set of new problems that I wasn't aware of. It's not strictly Freedom of Information Act, but it just demonstrates where secrecy is absolutely everywhere when we try to do this. So I'm not going to try and make this death by PowerPoint, but I'm just going to show you a thing or two just to explain how I got to this. So I happen to be, this is Richard Drax, the MP for Dorset South, and has been since 2010. And there he is in his full glory. I hadn't thought much about him. I sort of vaguely knew about him. I don't live far from him. And he lives in this house here, Charborough House. That's the entrance to here, along this wall. Anyway, I was driving along this wall one day. It's 3 miles long. And I was pondering Black Lives Matters. And I suddenly thought, that's interesting, you know, Colston and all that. But Richard Drax is interesting because didn't his family have a lot to do with slavery? And wouldn't he be a good person to take a lead in how we need to deal with this and come to terms with this piece of history, that is now the centre of culture wars, absolutely the centre of culture wars. You know, oh, slavery, oh, well, we did abolish it, didn't we first? No, we killed a lot of people along the way, and actually with some reluctance, and we had to pay people huge sums of money in 1834 to persuade them to stop holding slaves, a debt of enormous size we only finished paying in 2015. So I was mulling all this over, and I thought, well, that's interesting. Let's have a look at his register of members' interest. Now, I've learned from anthropologists the thing you should always look at as an investigative journalist is silence. And so I thought I'd have a look at his register of member interest. I looked at it and I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. Not a lot on there, really. At that point, I knew he owned a lot of stuff. So what does it say? It says land and property over 100,000, and it just says woodlands, farmland, residential and commercial property. It's all really vague. So I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. So I thought, well, I'll look at some of these companies. So the first company I put in was Abbott's Court Farm Holdings Limited. Put that into the company's house. It's not there. Well, that's a bit odd, isn't it? So, and then I progressed and I discovered there were all sorts of things odd about his register. And I discovered that, for instance, that no one had checked this because it's been on the register since 2015. Oh, I thought, well, perhaps there's something here. So I started digging away. And as you know, the members are supposed to detail their financial, but it's very restricted. And actually, it was never designed to deal with someone on the scale of Richard Drax. It was really designed for people who are barristers who would go into the High Court on a Monday on the morning, do a bit of work, and then tootle along to Parliament via the Wig and Pen in Fleet Street. Actually, dealing with someone that is this extensive turns out to be a really big challenge because it's another area that's incredibly secretive. And I'm just going to see if I can flip back to that. And so I talked to Guy Shrubshaw, who works with Anna Powell Jones, and they do a lot of very good work in this area. And he pointed me towards landowner deposits where I was able to piece together. It's not there for, general benefit. And I discovered that, putting all this together, and I haven't finished yet because I think there's more to this. These are the trusts. These are owned by trusts, which all fall under the Charborough estate, except this bit here, which belongs to his brother. And he and his family own, and ignoring the yellow, 14,000 acres. That's 22.5 square miles of Dorset. I also managed to discover that there were 125 properties in there, ranging from Charborough House itself, which he lives under under a really quite interesting arrangement with a company where he gets paid. He's allowed to live there in return for working for a certain amount of hours, and there's loads of tenanted properties. I thought, well, and his constituency is to the south of here, so there's only a bit of his land, but enormously influential, very powerful. He's in farming. He rents out buildings. And I thought, well, how would I, if I was an ordinary person, how would I spot any of this? How would I spot that there was a conflict of interest? And the answer is, no way. The register of members' interest isn't designed properly to deal with people's conflicts of interest. And actually, as soon as you start looking at land registry or anything like that, you discover it's all hard to get at. It's really difficult to find. There's bits of land I just can't locate. Sorry about that. I've been pressing on and discovered a huge amount of problems with getting basic information. And eventually, in all of this, I did actually discover that, for instance, he hadn't put this on the register of members' interest in any way that you would know it. He owns personally a £4.5 million house on Sandbanks, which he rents it up to £6,000 a week. And, that's one of the most expensive pieces of real estate, not mentioned really. And of course, the most interesting bit that I came up with was that a number of people have said to me, oh, doesn't he own that the plantation that his relatives had slaves on? His ancestors had slaves. So I thought, well, that's sort of interesting. And I said, well, how do you know this? And they'd say, well, someone told me. I said, well, have you got any documentation? So eventually we managed, with the help of a colleague who's in Barbados, managed to dig out, because they don't have anything online, the fact that he does, in fact, own the Drax Hall plantation, 621 acres, where his family had at one point as many as 300 slaves. This did not appear in the registered member's interest, because the registered member's interest says, oh, it doesn't matter if you're in probate, you don't have to register anything to end of probate. Well, he's the absolute beneficiary. Why doesn't he register it? Well, and this just went on. Everywhere we looked, we just got more. That's him. Now, he says he doesn't own it, but he's registered it as a business. He says he's done that as an executor. But the fact is, what all this comes down to, I think, is that where we've moved to with MPs, and you can see this with the Register of Ministers, is we are in a world whereby, firstly, as someone remarked to me the other day, we're in a self-certifying environment. It's really up to those who are. What we do is the government pretends to have rigorous regulation. It then turns out that actually it's self-regulation, and people choose what they want to put on there. And it's all very well to say this is a really tough law, but unless anybody's enforcing it, it's absolutely meaningless. So just to sum up this really quite quickly, because it's quite a complicated story, but one of the things I discovered in April was that, and it was, I happened to notice that he seemed to be in breach of a particular part of the Companies Act. And so I raised this with Companies House, and then a few weeks later, I noticed that he had altered 4 companies that he did own, and now, because of the earlier story, had registered. He hadn't registered their accounts or details when he was illegally applied. So from 2009 to 2021, he had failed to provide accounts for 4 companies, and he had to reinstate all of those. Now, somebody complained to the Standards Commissioner, who then investigated, who won't act on it, isn't interested. The Companies House isn't interested. So there's no incentive for enforcement here. It's all about rectification, because we're all good chaps, and no one means any harm here. But what do you think had happened to us if we forgot to put our accounts in for 11 years? There's a really different system at work here. And I think, this is, and all the systems work. You want to find out how much land an MP work. It takes weeks and months, and ordinary people can't do that. And if you're working with an MP who has an estate of enormous size, and you're a business person or that, you've no idea how much influence they've got when they're working as an MP, when they're working with DEFRA, when they're doing this, when they're doing that. So I think there are, endless areas that we really need sorting out. In addition, just the freedom of information, there's lots of areas where ordinary people can't access information about the people in charge of us. And I think, mine's just one example, but you'll immediately recognize how that will, that goes in with all the PPE stuff, all the good work that Joe Morn and people at the Good Law Project are trying to demonstrate, that how people got PPE contracts by, seeing other good chaps to arrange for. Oh, they can do that. They're a friend of mine. They'll be able to get some PPE from China. We'll give them a few billion. Never mind. Anyway, much work is to be done, I feel.
Thanks so much, Paul. I think that example really brings it to life, the challenges of accessing this information. So we'll move on now to our next speaker, who is Lizzie Dearden, who's Home Affairs and Security Correspondent at The Independent. Lizzie.
Hi, yeah, thanks for having me. I guess I'm here to speak about a slightly different threat to the right to know, which is not so much the withholding of information, but the intimidation and prevention of us reporting information, even if we can get it. So specifically, a lot of my experience relates to the reporting of extremism and terrorism, and the ways in which people involved in those scenes can be hostile to journalists and be wanting to prevent us effectively doing our jobs. So a trend that's existed for a long time but's become a lot more prominent in recent years is the direct hostility against what they might call the mainstream media among extremists of different kinds. It is common across all different groups, but in the UK, it's especially prevalent among the far right. And often that stems from a kind of anti-establishment narrative where we as journalists are seen as part of that establishment and are sucked into and blamed for various conspiracy theories about what might or might not be being done, or alleged cover-ups and that kind of thing. So this trend is putting a lot of different kind of journalists at risk, even people who aren't specialists and kind of accidentally stumble into these areas. And what can happen is that if an article or a piece of work causes some objection on the extremist scene, then increasingly, rather than doing what they might do in the old days of writing to an editor or something formal like that, the reaction tends to be people zoning in on that personal journalist on social media and directing their kind of vitriol to them personally, rather than to their outlet. And that can, of course, be very distressing, and it can either directly or indirectly impact then what that journalist can report, is willing to report, or what in some cases their outlet might let them report for their own safety. So my personal experience of that has been with a few people, most recently in a case that ended with Tommy Robinson being served with a stalking protection order. Then in November, there was also a public order case involving James Goddard, who was part of the UK Yellow Vests group. And in both cases, what it essentially boiled down to was them trying to stop me from reporting. James Goddard was trying to physically stop me from going into a public court hearing at Westminster Magistrates Court, where he was being tried for his abuse of an MP. Tommy Robinson was stopping me from publishing an article that I'd asked him for comment on about the way he allegedly spent supporters' donations. But actually, those individual incidents are part of a much wider picture where they and other extremists like them incite online abuse among their supporters and use a range of intimidation techniques that they hope will influence reporting by media outlets. Unfortunately, I found police to have quite an inconsistent response. So with in-person sort of real-world incidents, they're very good and they react very fast. With online incidents, there does seem to be a blind spot regarding journalism that needs to be tackled, where if people are questioned about their behaviour and they claim that their actions are a legitimate criticism of journalistic work or a response to reporting about them, then police seem to find that very difficult to deal with. And this is something that affects all kinds of journalism, you know, not just extremists or specifically hostile people, but, you know, a very negative, angry response. I've seen it garnered by colleagues who report on music or film or all kinds of things that you wouldn't think would put people at risk, but it really can. So I think at the moment that, as you know, as journalists and as an industry, we've really got to keep an eye on how our kind of freedom to know and freedom to report is being affected by this kind of picture, and not only maybe start educating journalists better on, especially young journalists, on how they can protect themselves, but also look at encouraging authorities and putting some pressure on to really respond to this behaviour and to not allow it to be tolerated.
Thanks, Lizzie. That's quite a scary personal account there, and we of course extend our solidarity to you in having experienced such awful stuff in the line of your day job. Frankly, it's clearly unacceptable. We'll move swiftly on, colleagues. Our next speaker is Aasma Day. She's a former HuffPost correspondent and JP Investigations Unit as well. Aasma.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for having me this evening. So I've been a journalist for more than 22 years now. I was in the regional press for 20 years at Lancashire Post, and then I was at HuffPost UK for 2 years and 8 months, and I'm shortly in a few weeks' time going to be starting at the Iron newspaper as Northern correspondent. What I wanted to talk about today is I feel that one of the biggest obstacles journalists face when it comes to investigative journalism is time. I'm a big believer in finding hidden stories which are in our own, on our own doorstep, in our own communities. But to find these stories takes time, to build up relationships with people and to gain trust. And I think that's something that's so important, that we carry on upholding these values and trying to carve out time. There's a lot of pressure nowadays with all the cuts the media see and how short-staffed people are, and there's a real pressure on people to get things done quickly, get things speed. But there's a real argument for impactful journalism takes time, building up relationships takes time. And another thing I feel is very important is for journalism to reflect the society we live in and make sure we have diversity in investigative journalism. So talking to people from all walks of life and all communities who maybe sometimes don't get the chance to have their voice heard. But again, it takes time to build up the trust, takes time to go out and maybe spend time with these communities. So I wanted to talk about some of the things that I have been lucky enough to have supportive editors who have given me that time to do. So I first started delving into investigative journalism when I was at the Lancashire Post, and we wanted to do a series looking at people living in our own community who were living on the margins of society, sort of the hidden problems going on. So I was very lucky to be given the time to just say, right, go off diary, go out and go and find those stories. Very much a brief saying, just go and find the hidden stories of people living on the margins of society. And we decided to call the series Twilight, and look at, when people go home, in their own homes and in the comfort of their homes, they don't know what's going on just sort of around the corner. So this took a lot of time because I had to. It was quite sort of overwhelming at first, thinking, where do I start? So I sort of took time going out and spending time with homeless organisations, going out speaking to sex workers, just building trust with people. But as a result, there were a lot of stories that were just happening, under our own nose, which some of the examples were a young couple who were living in their 20s, and they were living in a tent in a city centre park, which is just a stone's throw from the high street. And they were homeless, they were living in a tent, and they were catching rabbits and skinning them and cooking them just to survive. There was a nursing assistant who worked in the local hospital, who didn't have enough money to, kept having to say no to her children because they didn't have enough money to survive. So she ended up working as a sex worker on the streets of Blackpool to supplement her income, so she could actually give her family what she wanted. There was a mechanic who took a loan from a loan shark, and he ended up losing a finger on his hand because he couldn't pay them back, and he ended up being threatened by them, and he lost a finger as a result. So there's all these stories, and it just sort of really showed that actually there's things going on our own doorstep, but you need the time to go and find them and the time to investigate. And so that was what I did at the Lancashire Post. And then I was lucky enough at HuffPost to again be given the time to do things to investigate. And one of them was I spent a week following just one NHS bed in a hospital in Lancashire, where I just followed this one NHS bed, and it was looking at the pressures that the NHS faces through the eyes of one hospital bed. And by spending an entire week following this one bed and interviewing all the patients who came in and out of it, and the staff that looked after the patient, we were able to look at the national picture of looking at the pressures of ageing population, the pressures of trying to meet targets, the pressures of all the cuts and losing so many beds. So it told a whole story, but through the human stories. And again, a similar thing I spent a week at a primary school in a very deprived area of Yorkshire, where we looked at the impact of education funding cuts through the eyes of one school. But again, it was having that time to actually spend in the school, speaking to teachers, witnessing firsthand some of the pressures that they face, the impact of poverty, coupled with education funding cuts on these children and parents, and what that means. And again, it was showing that national picture, but through one school. And then my most recent investigation that I did at HuffPost was looking at Islamophobia in the NHS. So I started investigating this, and I initially thought it would be, I'd get reports when I started interviewing people and speaking to people about it. I thought it would be people telling me about Islamophobia, which they faced from patients. NHS staff had, you know, a racism director. And while I did get quite a few stories like that, I actually found there was a far more hidden issue, which was the Islamophobia that existed in the NHS, which was more institutionalised Islamophobia, which NHS workers faced from their actual own colleagues and bosses. So it was more covert, hidden, a little bit more subtle. But again, it took a lot of time to build up the trust with communities who may not normally talk to the media, and particularly ones who were happy to be named and photographed and tell their stories. So again, it took time to build that trust up and to build that relationship up with them, to tell them that story. So what I really wanted to really highlight was that time in journalism is so important. We're very lucky nowadays to have at our fingertips all the modern technology, which allows us to access information through so many different ways, and that's so important. But I feel it's really important to have a combination of the old and the new, and to not forget the traditional forms of journalism, of actually spending time talking to people, finding the human stories. And I think one of the biggest obstacles we face is when there's pressure on journalists to do quick turnarounds, and maybe you know, there's you know, a little bit more, you know, investigative journalism takes time, and you can maybe have, you know, X number of stories done at the same time. I think we'd be so much poorer as a society if investigative journalism didn't exist and we didn't have that time to do that kind of work. And also, I think it would also not be a true reflection of the world that we live in and the people that make up the society.
Thank you so much. And you've obviously touched on, you know, the issues of cuts to newsrooms that have been so debilitating across all desks, frankly, that we've seen for over a decade now. You know, I think that phrase churnalism was coined over a decade ago already, and it's exactly what you've just described there. Before we go to our final speaker, I'd just like to remind participants that if you would like to ask a question of any of the panelists, please use the Q&A button, which is at the bottom. It says Q&A, not the chat box, the Q&A box. And so without further ado, we'll go to our final panel speaker, who is Tim Dawson. He's an NUJ National Executive Committee member, freelancer and former Sunday Times journalist. Over to you, Tim.
Thank you, Sian. I confess I feel very flattered to be on such a distinguished panel. And confess really that my background is in campaigning on press freedom issues, and it's really about that I want to talk. It's fascinating hearing all these stories. I think one of the things I love about journalists and journalism is the capacity of people to go down wormholes and just look at something from every angle in the hope of finding a chink that's going to get them you know, a critical piece of information. The idea of Paul Lashmar as a neighbor from hell is fantastically entertaining to me, and what good fortune that he's investigating a man who shares his surname with a Bond villain. I want to sort of try and take a slightly broader view and talk about how we campaign on issues of right to know. And I mean, it seems to me that we, you know, everybody's touched on specific areas, issues, and as it were. But actually, I think as journalists, what we need to do is develop a kind of consciousness across our trade about the hostile environment in which we all operate and the multiple threats that arise all the time to our ability to do our work. I mean, all of the issues mentioned so far are absolutely pertinent, but they are but one or two of a whole range of things. Just to talk about some of the ones that have come up in recent years, you know, when it was 6-8 months ago, when the government started looking at key worker status in terms of people's right to move around the country to do their work, it wasn't their automatic assumption that journalists, that news gatherers would be among them. By good fortune, we had a strong relationship. The NUJ had a strong relationship with the government at that point, and we very insistently made the point that it was vital, if people were to understand the societies in which we are all living, that news gatherers were able to go about their work with the same freedom enjoyed by medical workers and people, you know, running power stations and so on. But, you know, that relatively small decision that was, you know, a minister was ticking boxes against the names of professions in Whitehall, without an intervention, we could have easily found that the press guard wasn't sufficient to guarantee that people could move freely to gather information. Similarly, I mean, again, during the pandemic, the ability of journalists to follow court cases by video link, the number of people being allowed into courts has been radically reduced, so much so that, I mean, actually, some public galleries in courts won't allow people in at all. The last court case I covered, which was 3 or 4 weeks ago, they initially allowed only one journalist in, and you had to arrive very, very early in the morning to make sure you were that journalist, because if one other person turned up, then they weren't going to let you into the courts. Now, for bigger, high-profile cases, I would say the Ministry of Justice have done quite a good job of allowing video access. But at the Crown Court I was in Canterbury, the judge simply, rather airily said, "I've had an application for video access to this court. I think that's a bit of a distraction. We won't be granting it." And that was that. Now, we will take that case up with the Ministry of Justice, but unless we're fighting constantly on these fronts, then, you know, the ability of people to know about things being done in their name is radically reduced. The treatment of the Barry and Trevor, the No Stone Unturned journalists in Belfast. I mean, again, it's very easy when things happen in Northern Ireland, if you're on this side of the water, to think, "Oh God, Northern Ireland convulsed in troubles, you know, weird and terrible things happen there that will never happen in the UK." But actually, their wholly unlawful arrest and the confiscation of their equipment was all signed off by an English police force, the Durham Constabulary. Now, you know, again, the NUJ fought that, and I think those people within the police service of Northern Ireland and in constabularies in Great Britain will think very carefully before they next authorise journalists to be arrested at you know, by armed officers at 6 o'clock in the morning and all their possessions confiscated. But unless we're sort of drawing, you know, joining these dots and saying we have to be always vigilant, then I think on any of these fronts that, you know, there's a danger of slippage and a danger that something that we think, well, you know, that's a long way from the kind of work that I do, but suddenly actually find it impacting on all of us. The attempts to extradite Julian Assange, I appreciate for many people, you know, not always a character who's seen in sympathetic terms, but the attempt to extradite him to face justice because of what he had published clearly has really dangerous implications for journalists all over the world, but certainly in this country. You know, anybody who annoyed the US State Department could potentially face the same. And although it's a relief that the extradition didn't happen, it was on a technicality, essentially, that the judge thought that he was potentially a suicide risk. I mean, a serious and troubling technicality, but nevertheless, that risk that a journalist who has offended the State Department is still there, hangs over anybody who's looking at classified US documents. And I mean, just a final sort of one that's very much in the air at the moment, and I think potentially provides a focus for getting journalists across the board to think about these issues. Reform is imminent of the Official Secrets Act. I think last week, Priti Patel published a consultation document, which has actually been very little reported and rather bizarrely misreported in the one national newspaper I've read in it. Now, some elements of the Official Secrets Act are genuinely very, very complicated. I confess, in the kind of earlier iteration of this consultation, the NUJ commissioned Gavin Miller QC to write a sort of idiot's guide to the proposals. And I have to confess that I'm so much of an idiot that I couldn't understand his idiot's guide. So I accept that elements of this are very complicated, but very early in this consultation, I mean, obviously, it's in the name of Priti Patel. It says a case has been made that there should be a public interest defence for those who leak official secrets, which is to say that if somebody was able to show, if a civil servant who handed a file to a journalist and was caught was able to show that they were doing so in the public interest, then that would be it would mean that they weren't capable of prosecution, or that a prosecution could be dismissed on the grounds that they could show that they were acting in the public interest. The consultation rather airily says, yes, we've thought about that and we don't really think it's necessary. Now, having a provision like that in a new Official Secrets Act could make a dramatic difference to journalism, and I think we should be encouraging all journalists to seek out that really rather dry consultation. And it doesn't, you know, it invites anybody to write in and say, I think, you know, this or this about that, even if it's only on that one point that's really simple to understand. I think that encouraging all journalists to think and to see that defending the environment within which we work and defending our ability to find stories and tell stories is something for which we must all bear responsibility. It's great, you know, that we have a union who are able to do this and who are, you know, through the subscriptions that we all pay, are able to fund, you know, lawyers to examine these things. But when it comes down to it, we actually have to act collectively across our industry and say, you know, I'm willing to stand up and be counted. I'm willing to write to my MP. I'm willing to knock on some doors and say what journalists do for society, the ability for the people to understand the world around them and decisions made in their name is dependent upon journalists being able to do their work. And unless we all defend our ability to do that work, it will be reduced and reduced and reduced until we all find ourselves really just in the entertainment and distraction industry. I know that that's not what any of us want, but I really would, I think anything that any of us can do to encourage colleagues to become involved even once a year in making a case of that kind, it would make a real difference.
Thank you so much, Tim, and you know, a big plea and a call out to all of you and your colleagues to make your views known as journalists about access to information. Of course, the NUJ takes part in consultations and we submit evidence on your behalf, on our members' behalf. But if you can add to that, please do. I think, you know, the training courses that we've run on FOI have been some of the best, some of the most popular ones that we've run as well. So I know that, you know, journalists are always looking to upskill in that area. We've had a few questions through, so I might just throw them open to the panel. We've got a question around, you know, your experience, however it may be, of the different attitudes taken in FOI requests, depending on who they're submitted by, whether they're submitted by Rob from The Guardian with his, you know, big weighty lawyers, expensive lawyers behind him, or if you're a freelance journalist, or if you're perhaps from a small title or a campaigning organisation. Would any of the panelists like to come in and give their experience and thoughts on that, and perhaps how it might be able to be challenged? Is there a difference? Is there a difference in responses that you've had in different roles, perhaps?
I might as well dive in if that's. Oh, Rob, no, I think you put yourself off.
Go for it, Jenna. Go for it.
Jenna, go.
Oh, it's I can only speak from my personal experience, and so it's, but I think I have noticed it increasingly difficult for me to access to even get a full FOI response. Now I don't know why that is. I mean, at the beginning, let's say I first started off in 2012, 2013, I usually got hold of communications by ministers, you know, full emails. I even managed to get text messages one time, but nowadays I just can't. I can't get that at all. I'm lucky to get a partial disclosure. I don't know whether that's whether other journalists have also sort of taken a sort of step back and thought long term about, and whether that has changed for you. But for me, it's just getting more and more difficult, especially with central government departments. With local authorities, like a local council, I do tend to get full disclosures, so it's kind of interesting from that perspective. But yeah, it's pretty bleak. I've got to be honest. Rob, I don't know if you got anything to add on that one.
It's difficult to know, you know, if you're how you'll respond, how they respond to you, depending, you know, if you put in a request as a journalist or as a member of the public. I mean, I know some people do put in requests, you know, using a pseudonym. I mean, that is one way of doing it. I don't know. I mean, I just the only thing I would say is just don't be downhearted. And I do think that, you know, freedom of information, I always find is slightly random, actually, because, you know, you can put in requests and you think, oh, I won't get anything, and then suddenly, you know, you get something fantastic. So, and other times you get a plain, you know, just being turned down. So I always think that if you've got the time, it is worth putting a request in, and it is a random beast. And I think what you're hoping for is, as ever, we're just hoping for someone inside the system who sort of has some sort of scintilla of thinking, yeah, actually this should be out there, and they give you a good response, which if you hadn't put in the freedom of information request, you wouldn't have got. So again, as Aasma says, actually, a lot of this comes down to time, and if you've got the time to do it, time is one of our greatest things, and if you've got the time to do a request, then I think it's worthwhile, and who knows what comes of it.
Thanks, Rob. Any other panelists on that one? Otherwise, it's
a slightly different point, but I would say that coronavirus has made the whole picture worse, because I deal with a lot of police forces and government departments, particularly the Home Office, that were all coming back and saying that the response to requests were being delayed because of coronavirus, but they're not really specifying why. Particularly with, I couldn't really see why in the case of a government department not directly related to the coronavirus response, kind of 6 months, a year after the start of the pandemic, I couldn't really rationalize that one. And within the last 2 years, I also can't remember a single request that I've put in that hasn't initially been refused, but then been allowed, either fully or partly allowed, on a simple response. So it seems to be that police and government departments are heavily overusing exemptions. And it's hard to know whether that's in kind of good faith, where they've simply made a mistake, or whether that's in kind of obstructive bad faith to stop us reporting.
Top tip there about don't give up. I think we've heard that from a lot of our panelists, you know, tenacity, keep going, keep asking the questions. Another question we've had is of our panelists, is there a story that you're especially proud of in relation to exposing, you know, information that should have been in the public interest? I feel like we've had Paul's, you know, pet story with the holiday snaps up already, but perhaps any of our panelists might have a piece of work or a story that they've worked on that they feel particularly proud of, or felt was especially important for some reason. They've obviously got so many options that they're thinking through.
It's just we're very modest.
Does Drax top the lot for you, Paul, or do you have any others you've worked on?
I don't know. I've not finished yet. Queen's Income Tax, I enjoyed that. That took a lot of digging, but I didn't do it by freedom of information. That was good fun. Spycatcher was hairy. There's been a lot down the way. I've not done a lot of work with freedom of information, I have to confess. So I'm not, I'm not a specialist in that area.
We're not restricted to FOI on this area. It was any sort of, a good story that needed to be out there, needed to be told.
I venture spy cops.
I think that's a hard one to beat, personally. Aasma, any that were standouts for you?
I think I mentioned the key ones really, like Twilight and hospital bed and the spending a week in school. But probably the most recent one, I think that felt important to me, Islamophobia in the NHS, because I had so many people get in touch saying, thank you for shining a light on this and talking about it. It's been going on for years and no one's actually talked about it. And I think that for me meant a lot, because I've had so many people come forward with similar stories. And I thought it was important that, something which maybe was sort of swept under the carpet and maybe disguised really as banter or joke, just a joke and things. I thought it was important to highlight, because I think particularly after what's happened with the pandemic and how much people hold to value the work the NHS has done, just to sort of really highlight that there's people from certain communities, backgrounds who are being targeted in such a way. I felt that was quite important to do, and particularly building up that trust with them to give them the ability to talk about what was happening to them. So that I think that was probably the one recently that I felt was important to do.
Thank you. Yeah. Not knowing what the story was until you started hearing people's testimony as well. You had one idea of what you thought the story was and then discovered it was perhaps something slightly different.
Yeah, and I think that really goes back to what I was saying before about time and actually having that face-to-face contact with people. I know obviously we've not been able to do that so much as we would like over the last sort of 12, 18 months because of the pandemic, but I think by meeting people, gaining that trust, sometimes you can go in and with one idea of what you might find, or go down pursuing one particular story, and actually go, find out it might be a chance remark or something that someone says, you can go down a completely different, you can find a better story. And I think it's important not to be blinkered, so to go into interviews with a real open mind and listen. So don't just go in there thinking, this is the story I'm looking for, so this is all I'm going to be looking for. And actually, if there's a better story, ditch the first one or park the first one and just go down a different path. You've got to sort of really listen and make sure you're not going in narrow-minded, really thinking this is what the story is. Go in there and let the people you're interviewing tell you what the story is. So yeah, I think that's again really comes back to time and having that support really to go and spend time building up trust and relationships and pursuing stories in depth, really.
Following your journalist's nose for a story and hoping your editor is supporting you and backing you all the way as well. Paul.
Remember to unmute myself. Yeah, I don't want to come out the old codger, but I mean, I've been 40 years in a dying profession that refuses to die. So I'm bemused by this, and I think listening to people is incredibly important, but also with people that you're interested in, hear what they don't say, because that can be quite revealing in its way. But I would say that, if we're dying, there's a lot of life left in us, because I find with the students really do still have an interest in investigative journalism. I'd say it's actually increasing, and I look around and I see some of our students now are all over the place and doing great work. Immediately came to mind is Alexandra Hill, because she's just made the people to watch under 30. She's at the Bureau, and there are other people at the Bureau that have come out of City, and these are great characters. And I think in some ways it's tougher now than it was when I started. And there's all these awkward people who insist on proceeding with this really annoying activity called investigative journalism, or journalism even. And I mean, I just find it endlessly uplifted that when they find the story and they get it on the front page of somewhere. And there's some really good people around. You know, Gabriel Progrand at the Sunday Times is hammering away there, and they're just, you know, it's there, and then every so often I get shocked when I see an absolutely amazing story in the Mail these days. I mean, it's a funny old business, isn't it? And something, considering everybody thinks we're manipulated, we're not manipulated very well, are we? Because we keep slipping out round the back and doing stuff. So, I'm pretty cheerful about it all. But that's probably because I don't have to make a living in the same way. But hey, it wasn't very economic in the early days, I have to say, and one spent a lot of time just doing it to be mischievous and actually demonstrating how the world really worked. So I hope I infused a little bit of enthusiasm and optimism here.
We love some optimism. We appreciate the optimism, Paul. Thank you so much. We're slightly over time, but Tim, did you have any thoughts or examples on those questions?
Oh, just to say how really fantastic that was to hear from Paul. I remember when I was contemplating becoming a journalist in the mid-1980s, writing to a friend of a friend who I think worked for the Western Mail, asking for advice, and he wrote me this long letter back on little bits of copy paper saying, this industry is over, they're getting rid of people, why don't you consider being an accountant? You'll have a much better career doing that. And 35 years later, I'm pleased to say that he was completely and totally wrong. And I think projecting that sense of optimism, even when there are aspects of the industry that are genuinely challenging, it is a good look for us all. Just one tiny thing about the joy of investigating. I mean, I remember doing a story about a guy who was sort of persuading people to create fraudulent educational backgrounds to obtain teaching jobs, which I thought was a great story, and spent quite a long time working on it, and the Independent went quite big on it. But a couple of days after it appeared, people started phoning me up saying, well, it's great that you did that story, but why didn't you do all the other stuff about this bloke? Because he's a complete bastard. And for weeks afterwards, different people, completely random people I'd never heard of, were phoning me up, telling me of all this man's misdeeds. And it's amazing how when you get something out there and people can see that somebody is interested in a subject, how it sparks people's interest. And, particularly if you make yourself reasonably easy to find, people start bringing you the stuff that you would never have found by searching the internet and that kind of thing.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. I'd like to say a massive thank you to all of our panelists for sharing their incredible stories, insights, tips with all of us. We will be making the recording of this available. So if you had a colleague who was desperate to attend but couldn't make 5 o'clock on a Tuesday, please send them the link. Please ask your colleagues to join the NUJ if they're not already members. And of course, those of you who are delegates, we look forward to seeing you at our delegate meeting, which is NUJ's conference, which is going to be virtual for the first time ever this Friday and Saturday. And final shout out to Sarah Kavanagh, who is our Senior Campaigns and Communications Officer, who pulled this event together and did the publicity for us. And once again, thank you so much to all of our panelists and for the work that you continue to do in this area. We really appreciate it.